Ciao, welcome to Delicious Italian. Today what I'm going to be making is focaccia. Focaccia is made in different ways all throughout Italy, and it seems that every housewife has her own delicious recipe. But in the town that I come from, which is called Mola di Bari, and it's a beautiful little fishing village right on the Adriatic Sea, this is how we make it. Typically with a tomato and oregano topping. That is very popular in my area. I find it very delicious. I love all types of focaccia, and everybody I know makes their own version. But mine has evolved over time, and I love it, and everybody that eats it loves it, so I'm going to share it with you today, and I know you'll love it too. So I have 1.5 cups of warm water here. I just took its temperature, and I know that it's at 114 degrees. You want it about 100 to 115, and it won't hurt it if it's cooler. It'll just take longer for your dough to rise, but a warmer is a little bit better. So I have 1.5 teaspoons of yeast here. This is active dry yeast. I'm going to add my water to the bowl and my yeast right in. There we go. I also have 1 teaspoon of sugar, just plain white sugar right in there. That will feed the yeast and help it to grow. Now, some people use honey, but plain white sugar is fine. You could use honey if you like, but I don't in this recipe, so I can't tell you how that would work. So I'm just going to give this a quick little stir. Now, typically when you're making something using yeast, you want to wait a few seconds or a couple of minutes to see if your yeast is active and growing and bubbling and moving around a bit. It doesn't take long for that to happen. I use my yeast all the time, and I keep it in the fridge, and I know that this batch of yeast is still fresh and still active. So I can proceed with my recipe here. I have 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. Now I've said that my recipe has evolved over time, and I've tried this with different types of flour, and in the end I find that the all-purpose flour, which most people have on hand, works beautifully for this recipe. So that's what I'm showing you today. So right into the bowl of our yeast and water and sugar, 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. And to that I'm adding the salt. Now I don't want to add the salt directly onto the yeast, which is why I'm adding it in there right now. Okay, just going to give that a little bit of a stir, and now I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil. Now I'm going to eyeball this, but you can measure it, but I've made this a million times, so I know pretty much how much to put in there. Not a lot of olive oil goes in the dough, but a lot goes on top of the dough. Now what we're doing here is we're simply mixing these ingredients together. This does not take a lot of stirring or kneading to do. It's simply stirred together so that all the ingredients are well incorporated. All right, so I think you can see how very loose and almost batter-like this dough is. It is ready to be covered up, and there we go. I'm using this little flat whisk. It does great work of mixing together a dough. I really like that tool. It's really all I use it for, is for my focaccia. Cover it with some plastic wrap and a tea towel. Now this needs to go into a very warm place to double in size. Depending on how warm a place you choose for it, it may take a half hour, it may take a little more than an hour. Just keep an eye on it. You want it to double in size. Before I show you our dough, this is my focaccia pan. It is well used and produces a very good focaccia. This I bought in Italy, so you may or may not have one of these, but if you don't, this is about 12 inches. If you have a short, shallow, that is, aluminum pan, it should do the trick. You don't want it to be a super light pan, but it doesn't have to be a really heavy bottom pan or anything like that either. Now I have a batch of dough to show you that has risen, proofed nicely. It's doubled in size. But first I'm going to show you how I prepare this pan. Now don't be afraid of all this olive oil, because There is a lot in here. You'll share this with other people. You won't be eating all this olive oil, but it really is an important ingredient, and it just needs to be there. You will not get the same result of a super delicious focaccia unless you really use a lot of olive oil here. So here we go with the olive oil. Now I just pour some in here, and then I simply use a brush to spread it all around. Now these are little indentations here on the side of my pan, and I like to brush right inside there so that I'm certain that my oil gets in there and the pan is nicely coated. All right, so now what I have here, and I'm not sure that you can see it, but I have, you know, a fair amount of oil in here and a nice layer on the bottom, and then of course we've coated the sides. So a good amount of olive oil, don't be afraid. And now I have some kosher salt I'm going to put on the bottom of the pan and in the sides so that it's seasoned all the way around. There we go. So now again, not only do we have plenty of olive oil here, we have a lot of salt too. Also an important ingredient. All right, now here is my dough. It has proofed. You could see it's very loose. That's how you want it to be. Now to get this out of here and into my pan, I like to use a rubber spatula, and I literally just pour this dough into my pan. It's almost more of a batter, like I said before. And that is the consistency you want. This is not something we've kneaded. It's not something that we've developed a lot of gluten in. This very light batter-like consistency will give us a very light, airy texture in our focaccia, and that's what we want. So the next thing I'm going to do is dip my fingers in this oil a little bit, just so the dough doesn't stick to me too much, and very gently I'm kind of moving the dough to the edges of the pan, very gently. Okay, now I have San Marzano peeled tomatoes here. These are canned peeled tomatoes. Again, San Marzano are the best type of tomato, and these are Italian, imported, and that's what I love to use for this. Actually, anytime I use canned tomatoes, I always use San Marzano. Okay, so these tomatoes are for dressing our focaccia, and I simply take them and just take little bits off and place them all around my focaccia, just like this. Just space them out as much as you want to. There we go. Now, typically focaccia when it has tomatoes on it, I should say, the tomatoes are kind of sunken into the dough. That's not because you need to push them in. As this dough rises, it will rise around the tomatoes, and they will be sunken into the dough a bit. So you just lay them on top. Now, you could use fresh tomatoes for this. If you have really, really good, really, really ripe tomatoes, whether they're cherry tomatoes or larger tomatoes, you can cut them into pieces. You can do the same thing here. But honestly, I like the result with canned tomatoes the very best. The texture is great. They're consistent, and this is what I like to use. But again, if you want to use fresh, you may do that. It's still a good product. It's just a little different. I'm gonna rinse my hands real quick here. All right. Now the next thing we're going to do is season this with oregano. I have dry oregano here. I like to put a lot on there. I feel that sometimes people are afraid of using too much herb. You don't need to be afraid. I mean, this is a main flavor here, along with the tomato and this delicious airy dough. You need to taste it. It needs to really be in there. So I'm going to liberally sprinkle this beautiful dry oregano all over this. If I'm making an herb focaccia, which sometimes I do, like rosemary and oregano, or sometimes I'll make a onion focaccia also. I'll show you that another time, which is also delicious. And sometimes for that I'll use the fresh herbs, fresh rosemary, fresh oregano, And I'm not afraid of a lot of herbs on that either, so I don't think you should be. I have salt here, but we're not going to sprinkle the salt on right now, nor are we going to cover this with the olive oil just yet. Those are two things that go on after this has proofed. Now this has to double in size. I'm going to cover it with a pan. The reason I'm not going to cover it with plastic is because that plastic, when the dough rises, could stick to the dough, and then once you take that plastic off, you might deflate your dough. So I put a pan on top, put it in a warm spot, and let it double. Here I have our focaccia, which has been rising in a nice warm spot. I have it covered with a sheet pan and a tea towel, and I will show you what it looks like. I think you could see it has about doubled in height. Those tomatoes are sinking in just a little bit, and it is wobbly and ready to go into the oven. My oven is preheated to 450 degrees. It's important that it be a nice hot oven. Now, when I mentioned earlier that you don't want to salt the tomatoes, that's because I didn't want to draw out any excess moisture into the dough. The tomatoes are fine, they're not seeping any extra liquid out. They're just perfect. I'm going to put on our olive oil and then the salt so that the salt sticks nicely. Again, I'm going to tell you, don't be afraid of all this olive oil. It's a healthy ingredient, remember? So all over the top, this is really, really important. Much more olive oil than you would expect. This does not come out greasy. It comes out just delicious. All right, and over the top, plenty of salt. Nice and salty. You want to season those tomatoes and the dough. That was a nice big pinch, and I'll add a little bit more for good measure. There we go. Right into the oven with this. This will take 15 minutes to cook. And here I have another focaccia that I had already made previously. Now you could see how the tomatoes have sunken in here. It has a nice golden color. Underneath you could see that the bottom is nice and golden and crunchy. Now this has cooled off a bit, so that also makes a difference in its texture. But I could reheat this if I wanted to and bring back more of that crunch. At this point, this is a soft, delicious, mellowed flavor on this focaccia. It's not crunchy right now, but again, if I wanted it to be crunchy, I could put it right back in the oven and warm it up for a bit. But I'm just cutting a piece here. You could see that nice, airy, bubbly texture that is inside that focaccia. It's delicious. Cool like this, it's wonderful to take on a picnic. If you like a thicker focaccia, really all that is more dough in a smaller pan. So if I wanted this to be a thick focaccia, I would make it with probably 1 1/4 recipes that I just showed you. But honestly, this height on this focaccia is perfectly proportioned to the seasonings on top, and it's very delicious. I hope you'll make this recipe at home, and I hope you'll join me again for more delicious Italian. Buon appetito!